I'm worried. I'm worried. Even at night, I don't sleep because I think maybe at night they will come for me. I'm scared to sleep.
Isabel is one of 300 failed asylum seekers currently facing eviction from their accommodation in Glasgow.
I was on my way to college and I had a car behind me. Beep, beep. When I looked back, I saw my housing officer. He took out a letter and gave it to me and told me, "You have to leave the property because the Home Office tell us that your claim has been refused."
Since May, hundreds of letters like these have been sent. When an asylum claim is rejected, the applicant typically loses access to support, including housing. These evictions are happening in such numbers because the government outsourcing firm Serco has lost its contract to provide housing to asylum seekers in Scotland. It does not want to be left paying for accommodation the government no longer funds and can't be passed on when the new contractor takes over in September.
Serco have issued people with a 7-day notice to quit their property, and what will happen is they will do this simply by changing their locks and forcing them onto the street.
In April, a legal challenge to the evictions was unsuccessful. So far, lawyers have managed to obtain temporary reprieves in 37 cases. And today it emerged 2 men had become the first Serco tenants to be evicted from their accommodation. Isabel is alone in the UK. She says she sought asylum in 2015 to prevent her daughters from undergoing illegal circumcision, which due to local custom would only take place if she was present.
My support is stopped, but I'm still in the house. I'm dependent on food banks now. Sometimes I am so depressed. I'm so stressed sometimes. I think of suicide. Yeah. Sometimes I think of killing myself because it's too much. Too much. I can't. It's too much.
If you have to leave your property, where do you go?
I don't know. I live on the street because where am I going?
And what about the option of going home? They say they would help you to go.
I can't go home because I don't want my children to be FGM. I can't go. I would sacrifice anything, but I will not let that happen to them.
So Serco would say to you, these people no longer have support from the Home Office. We're not a charity. We're not responsible for taking care of them, for housing them.
Indeed, and this is purely profit driven, but they are delivering a public service on behalf of us and the UK government, on behalf of taxpayers. And these are people in often a very vulnerable situation, and the UK's policy is simply to put them out onto the street.
The threat of evictions in Glasgow is not new. These protests in 2018 were sparked after Serco said it would begin evicting hundreds of overstayers who were no longer in receipt of Home Office support. At the time, the outcry stopped the evictions. So what's happening in Glasgow now is not unusual because failed asylum seekers are being threatened with eviction. That happens. It's because it's happening so rapidly and in such large numbers.
The UK asylum system is set up to force people who are refused into destitution for them to make the decision to return.
A lot of people might imagine, quite naively perhaps, that if someone's asylum claim is turned down, that then the government would move to deport them. That isn't happening.
No. The asylum system and the asylum support system was the beginning of the hostile environment, and we're seeing this now in action where destitution is a policy tool of the UK government. The reality is the third sector and the council are left to pick up the pieces.
The Home Office maintains that once a claim is rejected, there's no legal basis for continuing support. Last year, just 26% of failed asylum seekers were returned to their country of origin.
Glasgow takes 10% of the UK's asylum seekers, but despite the extra pressure on resources, it and other dispersal areas in the UK get no additional funding from central government. It's something the Home Office has said it is prepared to take a look at. But with the situation unfolding here at the moment, the problem is becoming particularly acute. In a statement, Glasgow City Council told us they had repeatedly raised the lock changes with the Home Office and were calling on the Immigration Minister to take action before hundreds of people were left destitute on the city's streets.
The law prevents local authorities from housing failed asylum seekers. In Glasgow, one of the only options, and only if you're a man, is the night shelter. Samson is 60. Originally from Kenya, his failed application means he's not allowed to work. But he is in the process of trying to appeal.
I slept outside the 2 days when I went into the refugee. Then from that time, I have been here since 2017, March.
So you slept on the streets?
Yeah.
That must have been hard.
It was cold outside in the bus station. I spent 2 days in bus station.
So yeah, this is the dormitory. Maximum capacity for 22 guests. We rely on grants, individual donations, no government support.
Are people worried about there being mass evictions? Is that something that's kind of concerning people?
I'm hearing from a lot of people who have used us before, who have then gone into accommodation support, being fearful of receiving an eviction notice, coming back to us, trying to reserve a space just in case.
And can they do that?
We are on a needs basis, so if
so literally
someone,
night to night?
Night to night, yeah. We can't reserve beds in that way.
Last year, more than 10,000 failed asylum seekers like Samson were at risk of destitution.
How do you survive?
You see, like now, the way I'm smart, these clothes we get here, we got some foods to eat in the night shelter. We just survive like that.
Survive?
We don't no money in the pocket. No money in the pocket, but we eat. Although it is very, very difficult because here we are from 8 to 8. 8 in the evening, then we leave by 8 in the morning. So during the day, it's like you are here, you don't know anywhere to go. You go to the library, you are tired, you walk aloud. 12 hours outside. I think I know Glasgow now, I can walk everywhere in Glasgow by foot. I spent the whole day walking. Yeah.
Do you mind writing your name?
With the Serco lock changes now underway, some local activists have begun organising opposition. But in a system where destitution appears to be endemic, it's unclear whether any action will be taken to avert this potential crisis.
Elizabeth Glinka reporting. Well, Serco told us that it houses over 15,000 asylum seekers in the UK and often allows people to stay after the Home Office has stopped supporting them. However, the company has a legal obligation to return these properties vacant to their owners. It says it has no choice but to stop providing free housing and regrets any distress this will cause. But it can't indefinitely provide free housing to hundreds of people who've been unsuccessful in their asylum claims. The Home Office says if someone has no right to remain in the UK, there is no legal basis to continue to provide support. However, we still provide accommodation for those who would otherwise be destitute and who are temporarily unable to leave the UK because of a practical or legal obstacle. We will always help people who wish to leave voluntarily, but when an individual refuses to return, then we will seek to enforce their removal. Well, I'm joined now from Glasgow by local Labour MP Paul Sweeney. He's currently Shadow Scottish Minister and has been raising the Serco expulsions for more than a year in the House of Commons. Good evening, Paul Sweeney. I understand that in your constituency in the northeast of the city, that's where the majority of failed asylum seekers are. Over the next few weeks, how many do you expect to be on the streets?
Well, we know that there's a core population of around 300 that will be affected, of which around 60 actually have right to remain as refugees. And it's actually a question of the council providing them with accommodation which isn't available, but also the balance of those are those who are still in the asylum system. And often many of those people are actually not what I would determine as failed asylum seekers. What they've found is their initial claim has been rejected, but there's still a significant amount of legal recourse they have in terms of further submissions of evidence, appeals, and also a fresh asylum claim. So there's actually a far greater process involved here, and that's what the Home Office is failing to address. It's actually crippled with its own bureaucratic inefficiency, that it's forcing people into destitution when in many cases they still have credible claims that can be challenged legally.
But what would Labour's policy be? Would there be a kind of indefinite leave to remain whether or not your asylum application failed or not? I mean, there is a problem, isn't there, that there are perfectly legitimate asylum seekers and there are illegitimate asylum seekers. And what would you do? Would you just ignore the facts? And who would pay for that?
Well, the issue is, of course, that many asylum seekers are unable to work and unable to contribute. Labour are very much committed to the idea that asylum seekers should be able to work whilst they're having their claims considered, and that would actually remove the need for them to be dependent on the Home Office to provide their accommodation in many cases, because it's actually the fact that many highly skilled people, doctors, engineers, academics who have fled to the UK and seeking sanctuary in fear of their lives are actually unable to offer any skills to their communities. I think of refugees I see all the time, midwives, medics who are unable to fulfil their skills, and actually it's frustrating for them psychologically, particularly if they're trying to support young families.
But whose responsibility is it to provide accommodation? As we heard there, Serco isn't getting paid for these asylum seekers to be in their accommodation, and they have to return it. So they are simply doing their job. Serco is not a charity. Who is responsible for financing asylum seekers who have perhaps gone right the way through the system and have been rejected?
Well, there will obviously be some instances where people have exhausted the process and they do not have any further recourse, but most of the people that I'm dealing with, in fact all of the cases that I'm dealing with, they do actually have ongoing intentions to further submit evidence and are actually still trying to speak to their legal counsel. One case I dealt with today, in fact, the deadline for them to appeal is on Tuesday. They're not able to meet their solicitor until Monday evening. I mean, it's totally unacceptable, the timescales, 14 calendar days from the date of the letter to submit an appeal. That is the sort of onerous conditions that have been imposed on many people.
But it's not anything. Within Scotland, there is no opportunity and no right for the Scottish Government to be involved in this, because this is not a devolved issue. It is a Home Office issue. Would you like to see it devolved to the Scottish Government?
I think we need to have much greater cooperation between the different tiers of government. Of course, Glasgow is the only city in Scotland, or only council area in Scotland, that is a dispersal area for asylum seekers. And actually, of that number I mentioned, 60 are actually have leave to remain and have refugee status, and it's incumbent upon the Scottish Government and the council to find accommodation for them and to help them assist into transitioning into becoming citizens here.
Just before we go, I just want to quickly switch the subject. Labour sitting at 16% in Scotland. You're absolutely nowhere in Scotland. This is the kind of, in a sense, here you are talking about, but it's the death knell of Labour in Scotland just now, isn't it?
No, I would disagree with that entirely. Actually, the polling average shows us much higher in Scotland than 25%. Of course, I was 16-1 at the bookies the day I won in 2017 when I met you at the polls in Glasgow at the count. And I think we've been written off before in Scotland and showed that we've driven ourselves into a very good position in Scotland in terms of being in marginal seats contesting. A 1% swing would see us gain a significant share of our old heartlands in the Central Belt back.
Thank you very much, Paul Sweeney.